If you're planning to make visits to Europe, and you've been told that you are allowed to spend 90 days in any 180-day period in the Schengen area, you might be wondering exactly what that means. The 90-day rule can be pretty confusing. Firstly, because you always have to look backwards, but of course the trips you're planning are in the future. Secondly, because the window is always rolling on, so you don't just pick any 90 days in Europe starting from your initial entry date, then reset the counter to 0 180 days after you first arrived. So this trip in February would break the rules. The counter does reset to 0 any time you stay out of the Schengen area for 90 days, but you only absolutely have to stay out of it for 90 days if you have just spent your whole 90 days in it in one go. So you could have this weekend here, that would be no problem. The information provided by the European Union, the EU, doesn't currently include any official videos to help you understand the rules, but I've spent a lot of time studying the documentation, and so I'd like to give you my own straightforward explanation of the Schengen area and how to use the 90-day rule. So where is the Schengen area? These are the countries that you would think of as being in Europe, in a general sense, culturally if not necessarily physically. For instance, Greenland is included, as it's part of the Kingdom of Denmark, although it's geographically part of North America, but not Turkey or Russia. These are the countries which make up the EU at the time of making this video. At the moment, the Schengen area includes most of the countries in the EU, and some countries which are in Europe but not members of the EU. This map shows the Schengen area at the time I'm recording this, but check the link in the description to get the up-to-date list of the countries in the Schengen area. So these countries have agreed a special set of border rules, which create the free travel zone called the Schengen area, which has no immigration controls at the borders within the group. These special border rules mean that visitors are subject to entry requirements and checks when they enter a country which is in the Schengen area from one which isn't in the Schengen area. But during the time for which they have been granted entry, they can move freely across any border between countries which are both in the Schengen area. Citizens of the EU and the Schengen countries can travel freely around the EU and the Schengen area with no formalities, so long as they don't stay so long in one country that they need to get residency there. Visitors are subject to limits, but the same rules don't apply to everyone. Visitors from some countries are exempt from getting a visa up to the visiting limit of 90 days in any 180. You can click on the link in the description to see the countries for which the EU has granted this exemption and the ones whose citizens need to get a visa even for a short visit. A short stay visa can be for a single entry, or it can be a multiple entry visa which allows you to go in and out of the Schengen area for up to 90 days in 180 throughout the validity period of the visa, which could be up to 5 years. Of course, other types of visa exist, such as airport transit visas for just changing planes in a country, or long-stay visas for working or studying. And some countries have older bilateral agreements which might allow you to stay in a particular country without using up your Schengen allowance. So check the European Union websites or the official website of your country's government or embassy to find the information relevant to your own situation. If you're from a country subject to the 90-day rule, but you have a long-stay visa or residence permit for a country in the Schengen area, the days you spend in the country you are resident in don't count, but you still have the limit of 90 days in any 180 for visiting other countries in the Schengen area, unless you have your residency permit because you live with an EU citizen who is a member of your family. If you live outside the EU and have a close family member who is an EU citizen, you are allowed to not count days travelling with your EU family member or travelling to join them in a third country in the EU, but you still might need to get a visa. If the 90 and 180 rule applies to your travel plans, it's important to make sure you don't go over the limit. Otherwise, you could face fines or deportation and maybe a long ban from entering the Schengen area in the future. You wouldn't want to rely on the border guards not noticing or hoping they would let you off if you were only a day or two over the limit. Some people have reported having to wait while the border guard diligently checked through their passport for all the matching entry and exit stamps and added up the total. And they won't have to check your passport by hand once the EU introduces the new electronic system for passport checking, the Entry-Exit System, or EES, probably early in 2024. Then you'll have to scan your passport every time you cross a border from a country outside the EU or the Schengen area to one within it, and it will automatically show how many days you have spent in the Schengen area, as well as checking whether you have broken the rules in the past. By the way, the EES is different from another system that is also planned to be launched in the near future, the European Travel Information and Authorization System, or ETIAS. That will mean that non-European visitors who don't need a visa will need to fill in an online form and pay a small fee before they arrive. That is before the first trip, then it will be valid for 3 years or until your passport expires. Don't forget that your passport must not be more than 10 years old, whatever its expiry date, and that it still has to have 3 months validity left on it when you leave the EU. So what exactly is the 90 and 180 days rule? At the date of the calculation, for instance the date when you are leaving the Schengen area and a border guard is checking your passport, if you have been in the Schengen area for a total of no more than 90 days, in the 180 days counting backwards from and including the calculation date, you are within this rule. If your total is more than 90 days on that date, your total visits do not meet the requirements of this rule. So to work it out, you need to know what date is 179 days before the date you leave the Schengen area, and then you count up how many days you have spent, including the day you arrived and the day you left the Schengen area. You include all of the days when you were in any country which is part of the Schengen area, except for any days in a country where you qualified for one of the exemptions I talked about earlier, such as a long-stay visa or travelling with an EU close family member. If you have spent the last 90 days in the Schengen area, you know that you have to leave and you can't come back until another 90 days have passed. But if you have some days left, things get more interesting because the 180-day window keeps rolling on. For instance, if you have used 80 days, you know that you have 10 days left at that moment. But by the time you start your next trip, some of those 80 days might be too long ago to count, in which case you could actually stay for longer than 10 days. Here's a screenshot from my app 90 Days in Schengen Planner. Here the user has spent 41 days in the Schengen area as counted on the 8th of November 2023, so they have 49 days left up to the 27th of December. But the one-day trip on the 28th of December shows that the total on the 28th of December is still 41 days, and you can see that they can actually stay for another 81 days between the 29th of December and the 28th of April 2024. This happens because their first trip started more than 179 days before the end of the planned trip, so each day you add to the end of the planned trip makes another day of the first trip more than 179 days before the end of the planned trip. So what's the best way to keep track of how many days you have spent and when you are allowed to return? If your travel plans are very simple and you don't spend much time in Europe, you might be able to manage with a printed calendar and a pen and paper. And just check that within the 6 months before the date you plan to go home, you're nowhere near your 90-day limit. On the other hand, if you're a frequent traveller and want to plan several trips and see what your running total would be at any time, and to be able to experiment with different trip dates to see whether you could fit in any extra trips or make one of the planned trips longer, the easiest way is to use a good app. You could also use a calculator on a website, such as the official EU one, which isn't exactly easy to use, And of course you have to be online to use it, and you have to input all of your trips each time. Or there are some other websites where you can create an account if you don't mind them knowing all your travel plans. So an app would be the simplest way to save your trips, so you don't have to put them in each time. And you want an app that's easy to use, easy to read the results, easy to change your trips and see the new results. You'd want to be able to put your trips in any order, and to easily put in a trip that was a long way from the current date. And you want an app that respects your privacy. It was when my friends with second homes in Europe told me that they couldn't find anything that met all those criteria that I decided to design 90 Days in Schengen Planner to be the app that they were looking for. That's enough about my app. If you want to find out more about it, you can click on the link in the description to read all about it on my website, or you can just click the link which goes directly to the app listing on the App Store or on Google Play. Or you can send me a message, of course, if you have any questions about the app or about my explanation of the Schengen rule. I hope that you have found this video helpful. Have a great time visiting Europe.